Welcome everyone who's coming in. We'll get started in just a few minutes as more people join this event. But thanks for joining us tonight. Really happy to have you here. Thank you all for coming in. We're now up over 100 people who joined so far. We're going to wait just a couple more minutes to let everyone who registered have a chance to join us. So we'll start a couple minutes after the half hour. So I'll just say for the new people who've joined us, great that you're joining us tonight. Really happy to have you here. We're now up close to 150 people and more, and we'll get started in a couple minutes just to let a few more people join us before we get started. I'm so happy that we're already getting questions in the Q&A session. We hope that all of you are prepared to ask lots of questions tonight because we're going to be raising really important issues. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute when we get started about the logistics of tonight's meeting. But so glad some of you are already jumping right in. Great. Well, it's 5:32, so on the West Coast. I don't know if any of you are joining us from other time zones. I hope so, but we'll get started. My name is Chris Benner. I'm the director of the Institute for Social Transformation, also a professor of environmental studies and sociology. And I'll be moderating this session tonight, as well as all the other sessions in this University Forum election series. So thank you all for joining us tonight. Some of you, maybe most of you know, the UCSC University Forum is an ongoing series focused on the relevance of our research at the university to the broader community around social, economic, environmental, political issues that are important, and proudly featuring the impact of research conducted by faculty at UC Santa Cruz. This election series is co-sponsored by the Institute for Social Transformation, whose mission is to support innovative scholarship that changes the world. And so I also want to thank all of the people who have helped make tonight possible. And once I do that, we'll be done with our 90 minutes. So just to indicate that there's lots of people who helped make this possible, and I'm sure I can't name all of them, but particularly those from University Relations, Nicole Silva, Kristen Palma, Paulina Fisher, Diana Hogue, and my other colleagues at the Institute, Evan Knight, Mikhail DeCipolo. Events like this couldn't happen with all the people who, without all the people who do the work behind the scenes. So really want to acknowledge them. And then a little bit of housekeeping, some details about tonight. We are recording this event, so we can make it available and you can let your friends and colleagues know. We're using a webinar tool that doesn't have a chat function, but we really want to hear from you. And the way you communicate with us is in the Q&A button on the bottom panel. So anytime during the session, if you have a question, just pop it in there. And for the last half hour, 45 minutes of the session tonight, we'll be in dialogue with you with your questions for our panelists. And then finally, just as again, of overall framing, this series is designed to really help put this election in a broader context. So we're not talking at all about the specific choices in this election by and large. We're really trying to understand how broader demographic changes, broader social movements on the left and right, the structure of our political institutions, how those all shape the opportunities of this moment, as well as really understanding how the unprecedented characteristics of this moment, from the pandemic, the economic crisis, the movement for racial justice, climate change, and how that impacts society, and a president who, in a whole variety of different ways, is unprecedented in US history, and how that all shapes our new political possibilities. Tonight, we're really trying to hone in on the very institutions of our democracy. For elections in a democracy to count, they have to be both legitimate and seen as legitimate. And we know from a variety of research that there are certain problems and challenges with our current institutional structures and limitations around voting rights and voting access and disproportionate representation that we'll get into. But we also really want to talk about reforms and realistic reforms of how do we create a better union and really build on the institutions that we have to make them better and stronger. And to help us with that discussion, we have two incredible people who come at this work from different perspectives. And I think part of what I'm excited tonight about is to bring those different perspectives in conversation. Daniel Wuerls is a professor of politics at UC Santa Cruz. He received his PhD in government from Cornell University in 1988 and has been at UC Santa Cruz ever since. And his research ranges across American politics, institutions, public policy, political history. He's been doing some particular work recently on the Senate and the founding and origins of the Senate, which he'll share with us a bit tonight. We're also joined by Kathay Feng, who's the National Redistricting Director of Common Cause. So she's out in the political policy space making a difference, where she works to challenge gerrymandering, partisan and incumbent gerrymandering. And in that role at Common Cause as State Director in California, she played a really critical role in the creation of our own citizen redistricting commission in California, which she'll also share with us a bit. She has a connection with Daniel in that she's also a graduate of Cornell University, so across the country connecting here. So Dan and Kathay, thanks so much for joining us tonight. In a normal meeting, everyone would be clapping. So I want to start with you, Dan, and really sort of frame this conversation a little bit by saying, even before this particular election, we have some sense from research, yours and others, about some of the limitations of our institutions of democracy. And I'll just highlight, one of those sources is something called the Electoral Integrity Project at Harvard University, which examines our electoral system and compares it with other countries around the world, and looking at, things, everything from voter turnout to public disaffection with the electoral system, to looking at electoral malpractices, to barriers to voting and disproportionate representation. And they rank countries and actually states also on a scale from 0 to 100. The best in the world is not 100, actually turns out is 86, Denmark, according to their ranking. The United States on their metric is the worst measure of any wealthy advanced democracy. Our ranking is 61. puts us on a par with Panama, Mexico, Grenada, other bastions of democracy in the world. And what primarily pulls us down is a combination of our voter registration practices and the barriers that creates to voting participation, some of the electoral laws, and then these district boundary issues that Kathay's going to help us understand. But what I want to start with is not so much those, which we'll get to, but this moment where there's a level of concern and expressions of concern about the integrity of this election and American elections more generally. And I wonder if you can help frame for us in this moment what you see as the primary challenges to our institutions around the integrity of this upcoming election.
Okay, well, thank you. I think it's no secret that for many Americans, the national elections are about fending off an arguably unprecedented threat in the form of the Trump presidency, in particular, his treatment of elections in America and his undermining the integrity or credibility of the elections. That's not to say there aren't problems with American elections. There are, and those have been around for pretty much forever. And since the elections of 2000, when it was a major crisis then, we've done relatively little to fix our electoral processes, to make the voting counts better, more secure, access better, and so forth. So this has been a process that's been ongoing. But for a president to come in and openly not just question what might happen, but essentially to deny that it's going to be a legitimate result, undermines what was already somewhat fragile process in this country. So I think, you could think of it this way. It's almost as though Donald Trump is conducting a grand psychological experiment on an unprecedented scale, right? How far can I go as president? How unpresidential can I be? How far can I go in sort of denigrating democracy and still retain the possibility of winning? The difference is that he is not simply acting in a certain way that might turn many Americans off and look unpresidential. He's actively intervening in what social scientists would call the dependent variable, the vote that would measure whether he is indeed still popular with the majority of Americans. So, he's making it almost impossible, or arguably impossible, to tell what the outcome of this election really will be. And then, we can go into more detail later, but as I'm sure a large percentage of our audience knows, just by watching the news on a day-to-day basis, you're seeing new elements of this problem fall into place.
Kathay, I want to ask you the same question, then I'm going to come back to follow up a little bit. But what do you see in this election as a particular challenge to the election being seen as legitimate?
Yeah, I really think that there are two scenarios that we've got to watch out for. One scenario is the one that we're familiar with, which is that the Electoral College votes end up differing from the national popular votes. And once again, sort of a national conversation about why the heck we have this antiquated system that essentially translates popular votes, but allocates them in a way that doesn't necessarily match up. And if the two are different, as we've seen in two recent previous elections, what does this country do about that? And it puts into the question, whether the president who's elected can still represent the entire country. I think the second question is a little bit more troublesome, which is that because of COVID, a lot of states, rightfully, are trying to give their residents as many options for voting as possible. And many states that have not traditionally relied 100% on mailing people ballots are now moving to that. And because of also the battle around the United States Post Office, many states are also extending the period for, you have to return the ballot by Election Day, but as long as it's postmarked on Election Day, you've got a certain number of days for that postmarked ballot to actually arrive into the election office. In California, but we're not the only state that's doing this, we're saying that that could be as long as 17 days. Some states are 3 days, some states are a week, you know, so it sort of varies state by state. And you could have a situation where on election day, a certain number of votes are counted and they swing one way. And then as the mail-in votes start to be opened up and counted, that by day 17, we could have a different result. And that could become a huge political bomb that is used by people who want to disavow what the results are, one way or the other, right? If election day is different from the days that ensue after that. And potentially the battle back and forth then becomes one where not only could you sort of say, well, on election day it's different from what happened in the mail, but you could have teams of people who go into election offices and start trying to battle over which ones get counted and which ones don't. Remember 2000 Florida, where they had the hanging chads and they were inspecting sort of ballot by ballot which ones to count. If we end up with a dragged out process like that, it could come down to one or a few states with just a few votes hanging in the lurch about whether they'll be counted or not. And we could have yet another contest that goes all the way up to the Supreme Court and ultimately has to be decided by a hobbled Supreme Court. And I know one of the questions is what happens and what's the implication of the Supreme Court losing Justice Ginsburg. At least one of them is that if the elections have to ultimately get to the Supreme Court and there's a battle over which votes count or which state procedures will matter, the Supreme Court could be very, very important in that decision.
Yeah, and I definitely will talk about the Supreme Court tonight. That was that very first question that came in before we even started. But I want to come back, Dan, to your point about a president who's even saying now he might not respect the results and raising concerns about mail-in ballots in particular. And you know, my understanding of that is that there's very, very little evidence of fraud in mail-in ballots. And yet there's also been, you know, concerns of voter suppression, of making it very difficult for certain populations to register to vote. There's been a lot of publicity recently about the case in Florida where released felons who have the right to vote are now not being allowed to vote until they pay off fines. So it essentially becomes like a poll tax that is illegal. So talk a little bit about sort of what those claims about the illegitimacy of the voting, you know, might mean in practice post-election if we get into a contested election.
Yeah. So following up on what Kathay said, you know, with a large number of absentee ballots, it would be maybe not the hanging chads from Florida, but as a couple of people have put it, postmarks and things like that, you know, that election monitors and any sort of recounts would hinge on people going through absentee ballots with a fine-tooth comb and throwing them out for illegible postmarks, for signatures in the wrong place, for dates of birth wrong, for everything like that. So it could be a similar process, a similar political contest over votes, but with absentee ballots, different things being contested. But you know, the Republicans Party has made no secret that they also plan on election day, you know, to marshal essentially an army of election poll watchers to go into very particular places. And, you know, for those people who show up on election day, and many people are being urged still to vote in person if it's relatively safe for them to do so. And, you know, if nothing else, delay the process, question people's right to be there, maybe deter people from going, delay it enough so that people leave their place in line and go home. These are all things that the party is actively doing. It's not secret. They're quite public about what they're doing. Now, they may couch it all in terms of voter fraud and voter integrity, but this is also the same party where you can find dozens of elected officials who at one point or another, including the president several times, have essentially said that they don't want as many people to vote as possible, that they want to make it difficult to vote. And, you know, Trump has said it in various ways, and local and state officials have sort of let the cat out of the bag at various points, that this is their goal, is to essentially suppress turnout.
Well, and part of what your comments point to is the importance of states in the way they run elections and how they're reviewing votes and potentially reviewing the legitimacy of different votes, and how they shape the electoral votes. I want to get to that in a second, but Kathay, I want to come back to your experience and thinking about California and the importance of sort of representation in California. And one of the key issues that's on everyone's mind is also about gerrymandering in the districts. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, just to make sure everyone's on the same page, what is the problem with gerrymandered districts? And what are we trying to do about that, and what California's experience can help us in thinking about that?
Right. So it used to be that California, like most states, drew lines for congressional lines and the legislative lines by having our own state legislature draw the lines. And it wasn't just our own state legislature, it was actually sort of legislative leaders, 4, maybe only 2, would get into a room. They would work with 1 or 2 mapping consultants, and they would work out a deal. In many, many states, that process is one that's controlled by a single party. And they literally, in order to evade any kind of public participation or scrutiny, will rent a hotel room next to the legislature or even find a bunker. And they'll draw the lines, and then they'll bring legislators of their party to that bunker, swear them to secrecy, scan to make sure they're not carrying any recording devices, and then show them the lines that are going to be adopted.
And how many states would you say still follow that kind of pattern at this point? I mean, these are the people that are shaping the leadership.
Little over half. Okay. Yeah, little over half. About 26 to 30, depending on how you count it. And what happens is, important states like Wisconsin, North Carolina, where we've been litigating in, literally they're doing that kind of secret, behind closed doors. You literally can see the smoke coming out from cigars kind of conversation that's going on. And then they're divvying up the state in a way to, 1, protect incumbents, 2, protect their party, and 3, if necessary, throw under the bus a minority community or other traditionally marginalized communities, if that's what is necessary to protect and hold on to power. The harms of that are that for any person, you go to an election and literally the decision has been made when you get into the primary, and oftentimes even between candidates of the same party, that decision's already been made to excise challengers. So you don't have a real choice. If you care about our democracy and you think that there should be more than one name on the ballot, that's one piece of it, both in the primaries and in the general elections. Another piece is that, as a whole, when you look at the state and you say, wait a second, in states like North Carolina, where they register almost 50-50 between Democrats and Republicans, why is it that 10 of the 13 congressional members have been drawn so that there's a solid Republican hold, and it never switches, even when there's a wave election or even when voters have changed their minds? And then the third is that it fundamentally disenfranchises people of color, because time and time again, they are the communities where if you've got to make a horse trade or you've got to make sure that somebody isn't reelected, you're carving up those communities, essentially pawns on a chessboard, without any regard to making sure that they're represented or they are able to elect candidates of their choice. And so we reinforce the institutionalized racism that our country has built in to so many aspects of our elections. So what I would say is that a piece of this is just sort of straight up political blood sport. Whoever wins gets the spoils of that victory. But a piece of it has been made far worse than even what we've ever seen through history, because big data and computing technology and brazenness of particular political partisans has gotten to a level where we now see a type of extreme partisanship in redistricting that we have never seen before, even in the last 30 years, as bad as it's been, or the last 50 years, or if you want to all the way go back to the founding fathers. There is a little bit of hope there, and that is that California in 2008.
So actually, Kathay, I want to come back to California because I want to make sure we have the hope side and what we can do about it coming up. But before we get to that positive picture, maybe we'll go a little deeper down the rabbit hole here, because part of what you're describing is what happened, after the 2010 census, and a set of redistricting happened, and Republicans paid a lot of attention to state elections in 2010. It was a rebound election to Obama, so major Republican turnout, and that's been part of what shaped these state legislatures that Dan is helping to point to, that are going to be influential in determining how votes are counted or shaped, or electorates are determined. And then it goes up to the Supreme Court potentially if it gets to that point. And we obviously have a vacancy in the Supreme Court now that's being determined by the Senate. So just in terms of sort of putting all on the table, the challenges of some of our institutions.
Yeah, do you really want to go into that nightmare scenario?
Yeah, and I promise everyone we will get to more of the hope at the end. But Dan, talk to us a little bit about the Senate. And maybe the pluses and minuses of the way it disproportionately provides greater representation to small population states, and how we should be thinking about the role of the Senate in the context of this election.
Okay. Well, there's a lot there. There are two things most people focus on with the United States Senate. One is the one you mentioned, that's equal representation, 2 senators per state, which has never really become a major issue in American politics. It pops up every once in a while. It is now becoming a little bit more of an issue, but the issue that's been, the part of the Senate that's been more in the news in the last several years has been the so-called filibuster. That is, that the Senate has had a rule that requires 3/5 or 3/5 of the Senate, or 60 senators, to shut off debate on any issue if any senator objects to ending debate. And my work focuses on both of those, and I'm a critic of both of these features of the Senate. Now, the filibuster is partly made news in recent years because, of course, it's been restricted, and that's very relevant to what's going on with the Supreme Court and court appointments. Meaning in 2013, the Democrats, when they controlled the Senate, curtailed the filibuster through a somewhat arcane procedural maneuver, and basically said that the filibuster doesn't apply to all appointments the president might make except for the Supreme Court. And they did that in 2013. And the Republicans said, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why you'd exclude the Supreme Court? And a lot of us said, doesn't make any sense either. Sure enough, 4 years later, in 2017, the Republicans pulled the exact same maneuver and applied it to the Supreme Court. So what that means is there is no filibuster you cannot filibuster against any presidential appointment, lower courts, executive nominations, or the Supreme Court. That's why there's essentially no real possibility, without a lot of Republican defections, of stopping Trump from making his appointment if they push it through. So that's what's changed in the Senate. So, I disagree, and we can come back more to equal representation in the Senate. But clearly what's on a lot of people's minds now is the filibuster. Of course, equal representation matters in this too, because Republicans are overrepresented in the Senate, on the basis of population.
Well, so talk a little bit more about that equal representation, because I think, as you say, in this moment around the Supreme Court appointment, the filibuster and the inability of a minority party to block the majority party's appointments in this case is important in the moment. But I think there's also a lot of concern about, some minority percentage of the US population, and I don't know the exact figures, 30% of population living in states that can have a majority of senators. Is that a problem we should be worried about? And what are the dimensions of that?
Yeah, and it's actually something like 20% can muster a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, meaning 20% of the American population residing in those particular states. And because we have partisan polarization, that now is correlated with state size and the urbanness of states, that's more of a real possibility. In the past, it was always kind of hypothetical, almost the same way that the Electoral College didn't have a partisan bent before, because it wasn't as clear which way it would go. Now, because of partisan sorting, the fact that Democrats live in cities and larger states and Republicans are more powerful in smaller states, these two things, equal representation and the Electoral College, have both been at least semi-permanently tilted in the Republicans' favor. Therefore, it is true that when Brett Kavanaugh was approved, people did make the point that yes, the senators who approved him represented something like, 40% of the American population or something like that. I now can't remember the figure. So yeah, that is a problem with the Senate, and it's one I'd like to fix. It's a very difficult one to fix because it's in the Constitution and even further protected in the Constitution than normal features of the Constitution. So.
Well, and what I really appreciate about your point is that that institutional structure relates to this political partisan polarization that's happening geographically in ways that, yeah, for whatever reason, the Democratic Party is not seen as popular in many of our rural states, and that's a little less true now than it was in the past. I think it's an important point. And I think it comes back to beginning to think about some of the solutions to these problems. Kathay, coming back to the redistricting issue, and some states have chosen strategies of having sort of equal representation on a redistricting between the two parties. California pursued a strategy of having a citizen redistricting commission. I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about the background of that and why we did it that way, and then what kind of impact that has had. If we get beyond the partisan politics to really let citizens help design the institutions that are governing us, what does that mean?
To understand how we got to the particular structure that we have in California, there's a piece of that which is a little bit personal on my side, which is I was working for an organization that tried to help Asian American communities participate in the political process, including answering their census form and, start to understand what is this obscure thing called redistricting and, why should I care? And in 2001, what we did was we tried to organize communities up and down the state to participate in the redistricting process and tell the stories of their communities and in some way try to be persuasive that, please don't cut our communities into pieces. And what I found out was that after 4 months of those public hearings, that in actuality, the legislature went behind closed doors and drew the lines the way they really wanted to. And in fact, I even got phone calls from some legislators specifically using racial expletives and expletives telling me, you're not going to put another F in Asian in my district. 2001. And it was such a shock to me that the kind of brazenness, that kind of assumption of ownership of a district that was personal to the elected, and also that we were watching the courts slowly erode the protections of the Voting Rights Act, so there really was no recourse. Without going into greater detail, there were lawsuits that were brought to challenge that particular gerrymander that was incumbent protective, and they failed, in part because the court said that redistricting, one of the things that's been built in as a traditional redistricting factor is protection of incumbents. And if that's what they were doing, even if they inadvertently cut up minority communities, they're allowed to do that. So after that redistricting, I, in my bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, naive attorney way, thought, what? Democracy doesn't work when you bring a lot of people to a hearing and try to tell the story of your communities? I thought that, that was what you had to do to participate. And so I decided to talk amongst a lot of my fellow colleagues in many different communities to say, we all experienced this together. We leaned in hard. We got people to the hearings. We told our stories. We thought that's what it was. And there was a totally different game going on that was a closed door negotiation. And the starting point was to say, how could we improve this process? And for a lot of people, it was just, could we just make these hearings more transparent? You know, that could we bring the thing that is behind closed doors up front? But the more we talked about it, the more we realized that the very people who controlled the rules of the hearing could suspend all of those rules, all of the open, hearing rules, if they wanted to, because those were the rules that we built into our legislature. And since we couldn't count on the legislature ever necessarily doing the right thing, because they needed to be able to have quick votes and do things behind closed doors when it came to redistricting, we increasingly realized that what we really need to do is not just create criteria for drawing the maps and transparency rules, but also taking the power out of the hands of legislators and giving them to a group of people who don't have a vested interest in how those lines are drawn. They care, they're politically active, it's not that. It's just that they don't personally want to run for those lines or want to give it to a friend. So that's where we went down the road of crafting this thing. And we looked around the country. We spent a lot of time deliberating over it and even working with the legislature to have hearings to learn from other states. And 3 years running, we negotiated with the legislature, thinking, again, naively, that when I stood at a press conference with the Senate President Pro Tem and the Speaker of the Assembly, each of them saying that this was the year that they were going to bring redistricting to a vote, reform to a vote, that they really meant it. And after the third year, when there was actually a vote by the Senate to adopt the legislation, and then they mysteriously lost the bill in the walk between the Senate and the Assembly, it suddenly dawned on me that this thing wasn't going to happen through the legislature. Maybe I knew it beforehand, but I wanted to believe. And so much like, Charlie Brown always making a run at a football and having Lucy yank it back, at some point, Charlie Brown had to realize that this was not going to happen. And so we went with the initiative route. Thankfully, voters in 2008 adopted the thing that we created, the initiative, and that created a 14-person commission that was tasked with drawing the legislative lines. And in 2010, voters doubled down, and so now the commission has the role of also drawing congressional lines. What's interesting is that I think some of the critique was, how can you possibly trust a group of citizens, right? What do they know? And you've made the conflicts of interest rules so tight that you're going to have a bunch of dummies because nobody with expertise is going to apply for this thing. It turns out that California has a lot of talent in our state. A state of, 35 million was able to produce about 30,000 people who put their name in the hat that first time round. And we had people from all walks of life who were engaged and smart and thoughtful. And as it turns out, when you have a pool of 30,000, like any university, you can find 14 people who are pretty amazing. And so the 14 people who served on that first panel, they ended up being very, very dedicated to the idea that you should have a very transparent process. They had over 100 hearings and meetings, and they really heard from every corner of California, how do you want to see this thing? What do your communities look like? How can we make sure that, you're not cut into pieces or that you're properly represented? That produced a map that by all counts, both sort of people within the state and also outside of the state, they sort of said, wow, this map and this process really was something that heard everyone and ultimately represented communities that have traditionally not been at the table, while also preserving, sort of the theory of community participation around the state.
And Kathay, let me ask you, with that broad participatory process, how did the Democratic Party and the Republican Party respond to the new map? I mean, is it something that has legitimacy and acceptance across party lines, or are there, grievances that still exist?
There are always individual grievances, because what ended up happening was, I think that just over a dozen congressional members found themselves paired up with another incumbent, and they weren't used to not having a district just sort of built around them. But on a party level, what's interesting is that when we were trying to pass the initiative, of course, because California is a blue state, and we're a state that is, our legislature and our governorship was controlled by Democrats, it was Democrats who are most worried about giving up that power. And at least I'll say that the political elite were fighting tooth and nail. But once the maps were adopted, I think that both sides accepted the maps, and they were willing to kind of battle it out on the election field, which is exactly what we were hoping for, right? Nobody said that, you know, there was a swing one way or the other. There were about a dozen seats that were toss-ups between Democrats and Republicans. And we've seen that through this last decade, they have fiercely fought for those seats and, you know, let the best candidate win or the best campaign strategy win. But it certainly has been one where we've seen some back and forth in control by Democrats and Republicans over particular seats. Both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party ended up acknowledging that the process was a clean one. And they've leaned in, they've doubled down this next time. But what we've seen is really something where they're now, both Democratic Party members and Republican Party folks go to other states and say, you know what's good for California? We'd like to share that with other places. It's kind of neat to see.
Well, this is what I was going to ask, and it was just the last question on gerrymandering, then I'll come back to you, Dan. But you've moved from doing that work in California to then trying to expand that model in other parts of the country. How's it going?
I will say that in 2008, when we were first passing this thing in California, one of the things that the political consultants who did the polling kept telling us was stop using the word redistricting because nobody knows what that means. And also don't use the word gerrymandering because nobody knows what that means. What we have found is in the ensuing 10 years, both because states like California have really posed a whole alternative, but because we've been slowly educating the public, we now find that in 2020, you don't need to explain what redistricting means or why gerrymandering is bad. And there's a real hunger to try to address this problem. In 2018, there were 5 states that put onto their ballot some type of redistricting reform. Those included Ohio, Utah, Colorado, Missouri, and Michigan. And all 5 of them overwhelmingly had voters adopt those redistricting reforms. The exciting piece is that 2 of them, Colorado and Michigan, have commissions that look a lot like California. They're very independent. They are sort of balanced in terms of party, but they also allow for a lot of public participation. They don't just allow for it, they require it. So I think that we're really seeing an idea spread. And I'm hopeful that in many ways, because this has become something where in that state you see electeds start to get comfortable with the idea of an independent commission, that it's not so scary, that eventually what we're going to see is a broader adoption in more states, including states where you don't have an initiative process. This year, the state that we're really looking at is the state of Virginia, where they don't have an initiative process. The legislature had to have 2 different votes of 2 different legislative sessions. One legislative session was when the Republicans were in control, and ironically, the very next legislative session, Democrats came into control and they suddenly had cold feet, but they did vote for it. And so it's now on the ballot for Virginians to consider. And we will see if Virginia passes this, they will be one of the first states that does not have an initiative process to adopt real reforms.
Well, that's exciting to hear that progress over the decade, and we'll all be watching Virginia quite closely on that. And as we move back up to the national level, I want to come back to you, Dan, and you know, a lot of what's on people's minds and part of why the challenges to this particular election are so prescient is the way that a president can lose the popular vote and win the Electoral College and thus win the presidency. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the Electoral College. Why do we have it? What does it do? And what do you see as the problems with the Electoral College and what we can do about it?
Yeah, I mean, just to start with the punchline, I mean, I think most people know that if we had direct election of the president right now, we wouldn't be actually thinking much about this election, right? The outcome would almost certainly be clear. Hillary Clinton won by almost 3 million votes last time. There's almost no reason to suspect that Joe Biden will not win the popular vote. Now, that's not to say whether that's something one agrees with or disagrees with. It's simply to say most of the concerns people have about this election all relate to the Electoral College. So why do we have it? Long, complicated story. But the main reason was that the Constitutional Convention, there certainly was almost no support for direct election, partly because of the complications of that at that time in a country, in the 18th century. Whereas the idea of, because also no one would know who these national figures were, right? So basically people saw it as being very state-based. And so the idea that electors would come together to pick the person made a lot of sense at the time. Not only that, it allowed them to dodge the bullet of how do you define the electorate in the United States. So what did they do? They said states decide who participates in, how the electors are chosen. And that's still the case, that, states could change, state legislatures could wake up tomorrow and change how we select the electors in California or Delaware and any other state. So it made it easier for them to come up with a way to pick the president by essentially putting it in the state's hands. They were the ones who picked the electors, and then the electors, pick the president, so to speak. With the advent of political parties, then it became very clear that it was all party-based. It was essentially parties would quickly came to essentially nominate candidates, and people knew that when they were voting for the electors, they were voting for one party or the other, for electors to pick the candidate of one party or the other. So, by and large, the system worked reasonably well in terms of picking a president. It's more in recent years that we see more of this kind of systematic set of problems with the Electoral College, especially that potential gap between the popular vote and the electoral vote, or the discrepancy, I should say.
Right.
So.
Well, and so solutions to that are things that have been proposed. I mean, there could be constitutional amendments to change that, but the other strategy, and I don't know if either of you wants to talk about this, is the effort to have states vote in favor of a national popular vote. And I don't know who wants to take that on, of that movement and the meaning of that.
I'm happy to talk about it.
Great.
If we want to jump into it.
Yeah,
sure.
Let's jump into that.
So, right, one way of achieving that is to amend the Constitution. But short of that, there is a different approach, which is to have a national popular vote compact. And essentially, here's how it works. Since the Constitution allows states to decide how they award their Electoral College votes, each state can decide that they will award the votes based on what the national popular vote results are. And essentially, if you have enough states that add up to 270 electors, which is a majority of our electoral votes, that would essentially designate all of those votes towards whoever is the winner of the national popular vote. Right now, we have 15 states and the District of Columbia, which then add up to 196 of those 270 electors needed. So you'd need to have more states come on to the National Popular Vote Compact for this to go into effect. But it is something where an increasing number of states are signing on. And that's one way of changing the Electoral College system before you go to a constitutional change.
Well, I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about what it's taken to get that passed in different states. And, one of the things that I've learned in looking more at their work and sort of the arguments for this is, when an election is determined so much by a few swing states in the Electoral College, the presidential candidates are going to spend all their time in those states. And so a place like California, it's safe. It, essentially doesn't matter if the Democratic candidate wins by 5% or 30%. It's, all going to go to the Democratic Party candidate in the state. And so, one of the arguments is that if you had a national popular vote, you'd pay attention to a place like California. Yeah. So I understand why it passes in California. But if you look at the states that have passed it, what what do you know about what motivates that, and how has it gotten passed in those states?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing is, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Kathy.
No, go ahead, Ben.
Yeah,
Jump
I mean,
in.
it is true, they almost all are blue states, right? There's some action going on in some purple or red states, but the ones that have passed it are mostly blue states. And that's unfortunate, because again, once upon a time, this was less of a partisan issue. You know, you go back to the 70s and 80s, and you do polls about the Electoral College, and it's still that a plurality or majority of Americans would like to get rid of the Electoral College and go to direct election. But at the elite level, it's clearly become more polarized, because the realization that the Republicans need the Electoral College as kind of a backstop in case the popular vote doesn't work out. So that's unfortunate.
Kathy, do you want to add something to that? That was great, Dan, thanks.
No, just that I think that, some of the purple states that have started to adopt it include states like Colorado. And so I do think that increasingly, as you start to see states say, this is not the kind of battle that we want to watch Americans have to struggle with every 4 years, and question the legitimacy of who ends up being president. But as well, I think it's important to just say that, for a lot of states, the ability for us to talk across partisan lines in state legislatures oftentimes comes with pushing for in-state reforms like redistricting reform and voting reform, which kind of comes back to that, right? Because when states have legislatures where they have to be responsive to their own voters, you find that the legislators are much more likely to come across party lines and start figuring out practical solutions. Colorado is a good example of that.
Great. So for all of you listening, we're going to move very, very soon to Q&A. And as I'm looking at some of the Q&A there, actually, one of the questions from Robert was, can you tell us the current status of the National Multi-State Compact on a national popular vote? So we're already jumping into some of those questions. But I want to come back again. One of the things that's on people's minds is the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court vacancy and different efforts to reform that. And Dan, coming to you, one of the things that has been talked a lot about is the ways that a seat that was Obama's to President Obama's to fill. Was not allowed to go ahead and in the 2016 election year. And now the Senate is going ahead and the president's going to appoint, and at some point the Senate will vote on that nominee, even though it's only 41 days before the election. And so I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, and then the other response that comes back to that is, expand the number of Supreme Court justices. Like that's one of the proposals out there in thinking about reforms. So I want you to talk a little bit about what do you think about that proposal and in terms of reforming the Supreme Court, and what are other alternatives we should be thinking about?
Yeah. So, yesterday in the New York Times, Stephen Calabrese, a legal scholar, published an op-ed, and that's based on actually a law review article he wrote in 2006 with another scholar. So this is not a new thought, and that is for the Supreme Court to be picked on the basis of 18-year term limits and staggered terms. So their argument is, and I agree with them wholeheartedly, and I think there's a good example of reform that favors neither Republicans nor Democrats, is that the problem with the Supreme Court is not its power, because liberals and conservatives both like the idea of an independent and fairly powerful Supreme Court. They may want it to go in different directions, but they like that. The problem with the Supreme Court is how it's picked, and also the lifetime tenure of it. So the solution they propose is to put everybody on an 18-year fixed term, but do it in a staggered fashion. And so every president would have, a one-term president would have 2 shots in his first or her first or third year of the presidencies. So everyone knows this is coming every first and third year, and then the process is regularized. It reduces the gamesmanship, so to speak, of strategic retirements and things like that. Also, 18 years, you'd be less likely to have the untimely passing of people like Justice Ginsburg and so forth. And therefore, you relegate it to this more steady, known process. And it takes a lot of this anxiety and sort of gamesmanship out of it. So I think that's a good example of the kind of reform we could have. I don't like the idea of packing the court. Here's why, meaning expanding the court, as some Democrats are proposing right now. And it's not simply because it was tried by Franklin Roosevelt and was a political disaster when he tried that back in the 1930s. It's also the fact that all it does, it just takes Congress to pass a law to expand the court. They can do it to any federal court. They can do it, they can expand the membership. They can get rid of all federal district courts if they wanted to tomorrow, if they could pass the bill. So they can do this. The question is, what's the end game? Okay, a Democratic Congress comes in and expands the court. The Republican Congress comes in and they cut the court in half, and where do you end this, right? So it would make people maybe feel good for a while, but especially if the Democrats tried to do that quickly, I think that could actually backfire much in the same way that FDR's attempt to pack the court backfired in 37.
That's great.
Can I add a few thoughts?
Please, Kathy.
I like exactly where Dan is going. I think that makes a lot of sense. And we certainly at Common Cause have been thinking about this question about, term limits or trying to make something more regularized. Along those lines, I think we should be much more regularized about what the Senate confirmation process is. Prior to more recent battles around Supreme Court justice appointments, there was a fairly standard process, and the average number of days was about 2 months. Took about 60 days to 71 days to go through an entire confirmation process. It generally started with an FBI investigation, a full-blown one. It generally had the opportunity for senators to have individual meetings with the nominee. It generally had Senate confirmation hearings where a full list of a roster of witnesses could be interviewed and brought out with questions before the public, right? And then, of course, the interview of the nominee themselves. And then lastly, there's always been this very long questionnaire that nominees go through. And in the past, they have responded in full. They have not held back information, and they have further elaborated when questions have come up from senators. I think that if we agreed to say that that is an important process to protect, and that anybody who goes through that process then should have an up or down vote by the Senate, one way or the other. You don't like them, put your name down, as on the record. But it should not be one where you either A, can truncate the process, go through a bunch of, fake motions and then vote, or where you can stymie a process by not giving someone a full up or down vote. And that would then apply for, a Congress that is controlled by Democrats or Republicans, presidency that is Republican or Democrat. If you go through this step-by-step thing and it's a full vetting, then at least everybody gets to see who that nominee is, and we get to kind of kick the tires, as it were. And I would say that, at least if we articulated that as sort of the baseball rules going forward, along with what Daniel is suggesting, I think it would bring a lot more regularity to this and more trust. There is an honest distrust right now of the Supreme Court that sort of goes to a point where we feel like it is so dominated by partisan games that, in essence, this has become a battle that is not about trying to create a third branch, but just trying to toss that branch to control by a certain party.
Well, and I appreciate those suggestions too, because as attractive as the term limits option is, to me at least, and I should mention that we have a number of questions here, and I'm moving to, and Faye's question was precisely that: how can we set up term limits? But that would take a constitutional amendment, so that whole process of getting passed. So, it's nice to have some other things that we might think about that could happen in the meantime. So moving to your questions, and please continue to ask more because they're great. I actually want to stick with the Supreme Court. Have either of you talk a bit about, the question is from Wallace, what are the implications of the death of Justice Ginsburg, particularly in this moment? We've talked a bit about the structure and the institution of the Supreme Court, and I think that's important, but I wonder if either of you want to say anything about Justice Ginsburg's role in particular and her death in this election.
I'll bring up one in particular that's near and dear to my heart, and that is about the protection of independent redistricting commissions or any other alternative system that the people want to vote in using the initiative process. In 2015, there was a case that came out of Arizona. It was Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission versus Arizona Legislature. The legislature was dissatisfied with not having the power to draw their own lines, and they wanted to be able to get rid of this annoying thing that voters had imposed on them. And so they challenged the right of voters to create an independent redistricting commission. And it was Justice Ginsburg who authored that opinion. And she found 4 other people to vote with her, not just the liberals on the court, but also Anthony Kennedy. Problem is that Anthony Kennedy is no longer on the Supreme Court. And so between Justice Ginsburg passing away and Anthony Kennedy stepping down, we no longer have that 5-person majority that might continue to protect the reforms that voters have put into place to address the problem of partisan and racial gerrymandering. That puts into jeopardy not only California, but the about dozen states that have some alternative system that was put in place by an initiative process. It also, I think, forces us to then say, is the only solution to have the legislature, to try to tie the hands of the legislature when we know what human nature is about. It means that we may be looking at Justice Roberts and seeing whether or not he would, for institution's sake, cross over, but it still doesn't get us to the 5 votes. And so if there is a case that tries to challenge maps, not just maps in and of themselves, but sort of the right of the people to create an alternative process, we could be in trouble.
Thank you for that. Dan, do you want to say anything about Justice?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, just at the more general level, were she to be replaced by a Trump nominee of the kind he's said he would nominate, it would be, a profound shift in the court because a lot of the recent court switches haven't been as meaningful. After all, Kavanaugh comes in, Kavanaugh and Gorsuch come in, replacing 2 fairly conservative justices. So that was not an earthquake on the court. This is more of a real shift in the balance of power potentially, across many issues. Yeah.
And clearly one of the first things that we may encounter is a battle over how to count the votes, as we mentioned before. And if it goes to the courts the way that Bush v. Gore did, unfortunately, I think people will feel very cynical about whatever the outcome is, and that's unfortunate, right? Because it once again puts into jeopardy. It's not just the outcome of the election; it's that we start to question each branch of government. Right.
Well, I want to come to a question that Franklin asked here in a little context. I mean, one of the things that many of us have been talking about is the likelihood that on election night, we may not have a result. And part of the reason for that is the vastly larger number of mail-in ballots, and takes a longer time to count and validate mail-in ballots. Franklin's question is, with mail-in ballots, can they be counted earlier when they're received, or must they wait till election day or later to be counted, or does that depend on the state?
I can say what California does, and I think it sort of depends on the state and what the election officials choose to do. But in California, what the election officials do is that they spend those, if your mail-in ballot arrives before election day, they spend that time to validate it, right? They're checking the signatures, they're making sure that kind of all the information is correct. But they're waiting until election day to split open the envelope and throw it into the ballot counting machine. Daniel, you may have other sort of knowledge about what other states do, but typically speaking, they wait for election day so that it's sort of all done in one process when you start running the counting machines. You don't have a pre-vote because you always worry about challenges that may happen sort of, if you've started counting before Election Day, you also worry that there may be, allegations of tampering.
Yeah, and it's as people probably know, states have been considering. It is based on state law, so states decide themselves how to do this, and states have been considering whether to open it up more, to allow a longer period for both the ballots to arrive and the ballots to be counted. And it's the case that Republicans have been challenging some of those efforts in states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and so forth, where they've considered trying to keep the process more open because of this extraordinary situation. So.
Interesting.
I just want to say one little note, and it sort of goes back to the Supreme Court nominations as well, but this question about sort of earlier voting. We already know that there are about just over a half dozen states that have already started voting, right? Folks may remember, you've seen some newspaper or news clips that Virginia has started to vote. But in addition, Minnesota, Michigan, Vermont, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, South Dakota, and Wyoming. Some of these states are big states, they're swing states, right? And the fact that voting has already started really says that it's not just an election year. It's not just that we are, sort of in an election campaign. Voting has started. And I do think that because, our voting period is now a little bit longer, the question is, should Supreme Court nominations be considered once voting has started? Now, I would ask Dan that. Does it make a difference? You used to be it was an election day. But if you've got a month or a month and a half, is that period supposed to be sacrosanct, and you shouldn't use that as, sort of a punching bag? I guess you can't stop people from making it a punching bag, but should it be off limits?
Well, obviously there's nothing to stop them. And, we're having a battle over sort of constitutional norms, meaning what is fair play, right? Do you try to fill a seat this close to the election or not? There's nothing constitutionally to stop them from doing that. But it's an interesting point that in some ways the election is actually underway as opposed to simply, a month away or so. Yeah, but
which might be the distinction between now and what happened with Merrick Garland.
Yeah. But the Republicans have made clear that they're behind the president almost univocally, and at some level, one of the most extraordinary things is their argument, and this you're hearing from a lot of people, that they are owed a conservative Supreme Court. That the country, has had a liberal Supreme Court for too long, even though most of them were appointed by Republican presidents, and that they're actually owed a conservative, court. And that I think what we've seen is the knives coming out because this opportunity is just too good to miss. So that's part of what's rallying a lot of these Republicans, is that this has just put too fine of a focus on what's at stake.
Well, there's a number of other questions here about the Supreme Court. And one is an idea I hadn't heard before, but this is from Ken, who asks, why not expand the court to a much larger number, like 50, and then have each decision made on the basis of a random pool of members of that court? And I'm not a legal scholar at all, but he says, would this appointment could be made on some equitable basis, but this would not require a constitutional amendment. Isn't this like the appellate system?
Yeah.
So have you heard of that proposal and idea, and what do you think about it, either of you?
That's the first I've heard of that. That's sort of analogy almost to the lower federal court system, that, you could end up in one jurisdiction or another and therefore create a Supreme Court that kind of mirrors that in a more centralized way. And then, as the question asks, I guess, or point posits, randomize the selection based on cases. I'd have to think about that. That's new to me. Interesting.
There's another question here, sort of following up on some of the earlier conversation from Jill, who was trying to fully understand, like, how does the national compact regarding the Electoral College actually work in practice? And I realize maybe we jumped over that of it saying, the electors vote for the national popular vote, but just explain the mechanisms of how that would actually work.
Right. So the way elections work right now is that you need to have 270 electors, those individual people, vote for a candidate in order for that candidate to become president, right? And so if you figure that each state has a certain number of electors, I think in California it would be 53 plus 2, so we have 55 electors, right? If you get enough states that add up to that 270 electors to become the majority that could choose the president, and each one of those states says, okay, here's how we're going to allocate our electors. We're going to tell them to vote for whoever has won the national popular vote. Then that essentially controls the outcome of the election regardless of what happens within your state, right? So it's essentially saying we're all voting, but we're going to look at the overall vote outcome and not a vote outcome that is determined state by state. And if 270 of those electors all vote for whoever the winner of the national popular vote is, you are in essence aligning the Electoral College with the national popular vote process. And as I mentioned before, there are now 15 states plus DC that have signed on, so that equals 196 of the electoral votes that states have already said, okay, if we get up to 270 electors, we all promise that we're going to jump in together, you know, sort of like a, I don't know, a dare game, you know, if we all do it, then we'll all hold hands and jump into the swimming pool together.
Yeah, and the reason that is, one reason that is because any state would be foolish to try to do it by itself, to go to award its electors that way, because you'd be undermining your vote with no support from the other states. You'd be throwing your votes away in some ways. And the other thing is, just to make sure people understand, it's written into state law. You pass this, you've written into state law that you, at the first election at which the compact reaches or exceeds 270 electoral votes, the electors from our state will be awarded to. It's written into state law. So it's a commitment written into state law, just the same way the state laws currently define how the electors are awarded. So.
So I think this question will go to you, Dan, because it's about the Senate. And I don't know, it's really actually two questions from two different people about sort of thinking about our electoral institutions compared to other countries. And the question from Jim is, can we make the Senate more like the House of Lords? And since I don't know how the House of Lords works, I don't know if you do as a US political scholar, but
I presume he means something more than just wearing wigs.
Yeah, I think it's more of a parliamentary system, and you know, sort of that. And you know, that's another question was about, you know, what is it that has made our electoral institutions perform so much less well than other sort of advanced democracies?
So the House of Lords, you know, to make a long answer a little shorter, you know, obviously in Great Britain, without a written constitution, the House of Lords has evolved over the centuries, really, as its power has been gradually diminished step by step. And, you know, the House of Commons, it's essentially a one-house legislature now. So it would be very difficult to do the same thing for the Senate, because you'd have to rewrite huge portions of the Constitution, because in many ways the Senate is more powerful than the House. It controls appointments. Treaties aren't as important that they are, but it still controls treaties. So you'd essentially have to rewrite significant portions of the Constitution. So I would be less inclined to go that direction, even though in some ways I'm in favor of getting rid of the Senate altogether. I would favor, still a very tough nut to crack, but as we started with towards the beginning, getting rid of equal representation and creating a more national Senate. So.
Kathy, this is back to you. This is from Bernard. Is there any recent evidence that California's top two primary system, and you might need to explain that a little bit, leads to a less partisan, more effective state legislature?
So top two is the process whereby during the primary, you essentially put all candidates onto the ballots, and it doesn't matter whether they're Democrats or Republicans. You voter gets to see all of those options, and whoever gets the whichever two candidates get the most number of votes move on to the general election. What that can result in is in places that are heavily Democratic in registration, you could end up with two Democrats, and in places that are heavily Republican in registration, you could end up with the top two candidates being two Republicans. It has happened, though not very often. What also can happen is that in a place that's very Democratic, you could have so many Democratic candidates that they end up splitting the votes equally, and then, you know, somebody from the other party or two people from the other party kind of come in. Also, not that often, but it does happen. I'm just sort of outlining sort of the reality of having this for a few years. The question about whether it has a moderating effect is interesting because the first maps that were drawn under the Citizens Redistricting Commission started in 2012. And that's also when we had top two elections come on board. And so one of the challenges for political scientists like Dan is how do you pull apart what might be attributed to redistricting reforms and what might be attributed to top two in California. What I will say is that we've seen the behavior of donors and entities that get into politics change. And this is one of the most common examples. In Orange County, for instance, which has sort of more Republicans than Democrats, you oftentimes will have two Republicans advancing from the primary to the general. And we have seen an increasing number of Democratic donors, including unions, but also individuals, look for the candidate who they think is more moderate amongst the two Republicans and support that candidate. Vice versa, we've also seen instances where there are two Democrats on the ballot, and we've seen Republican donors kind of lean in to try to support whoever the moderate Democrat is. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to win, but we have seen an increasing body of individuals within the state legislature who represent that middle, that moderate middle. And that's a little bit because their seat has been drawn to allow for swings back and forth between Democrats and Republicans to win. But it can also be because the top two election has created a situation where you've got a moderate of one party and somebody a little bit further to the extreme of that party, and it's the moderate who ends up winning.
Great. So Dan, this is a question for you from Paul. And the question is, where does the proposals for new states stand? What's the status of that? So Washington, D.C. Has no representation in the Senate. Puerto Rico is another possibility. So the question is asking sort of what's the status, but I think there's a broader question there of, you know, what would potentially adding additional states mean for the Senate and representation?
Yeah. So this is where equal representation in the Senate, two-senator state, has sort of come up as a political issue, is the idea that, well, it's very hard to change equal representation by changing the Constitution. So what can you do? Almost like expanding the Supreme Court, right? You know, you're on the losing end of equal representation, or the Supreme Court, expand the Supreme Court, expand the number of states. And maybe, you know, that's a little harder because you actually have to have territory you can turn into states, you know, but we do have DC and we do have Puerto Rico. And, you know, so the argument is make those into states. Now, clearly DC would elect two very liberal Democrats as senators. In my mind, I sort of feel the same way about packing the Supreme Court. That is, if they're justified in being states, then make them states because of that. Don't make them states because you're trying to change the Senate. You know, much as I'd like to see change in the Senate, you know, because in some ways it obviously reflects the problem rather than solves it. After all, DC would be the second or third smallest state and have two senators. Yes, it would give African Americans greater representation, and I'm all for that, but it certainly doesn't solve the problem of equal representation. But, you know, it starts with Congress. Congress controls the admission of states. In the late 1800s, they were manufacturing states out of places like the Dakota Territories, Montana, Idaho, willy-nilly, you know, and basically it became a fountain of Republican senators for about 40 straight years. So We have done this before.
There is another question that's related, which is, why do we have 435 on the House of Representatives side? And that number was actually, it's not written in stone. It's nowhere in the Constitution. It was created in the 1930s. And really, one might ask, you know, given the growth of this country's population, should we think about adjusting that number in any way? And to the extent that, you know, California, with a very, very populous number of people in the state, our congressional districts tend to be almost twice the size of a state like Wyoming, because our population is just so big. Does it make sense to increase the number of overall members of the House of Representatives? And you might be able to do that with a better eye towards balancing out some of that power that doesn't feel as awkward as something that you might do in the Senate.
And that could be just done by an act of Congress, Kathy, or where would that happen?
It can be.
So here's another question for you from Roger, which is asking you to comment on the effect of the Supreme Court's ruling in Rucho versus Common Cause, which held that partisan gerrymandering is a political question beyond the reach of federal courts. My understanding is that it, you know, depends on the state. So yeah, if you can just comment a little bit on what that case was and what it means.
Thanks for bringing up my heartbreak. So for many, many years, one of the things that we were pursuing, because Justice Kennedy left open this question, was, is partisan gerrymandering unconstitutional? And one of the things that the Supreme Court struggled with was, well, we know that partisan gerrymandering is bad. And they said it in multiple cases. We just can't figure out how to measure it or to create a yardstick that seems to be fair for everybody, right? And so over the course of, you know, many years recently, you know, 2015, 16, 17, we attempted to work on a measure that either one could say was quantitatively sort of measurable or a legal measure that the Supreme Court might accept. Our last hope was for Anthony Kennedy to answer his own question by finding a case that sort of seemed to give him the measure that he was looking for. In 2017, we had 3 cases that kind of were almost ready. The first one that came up was Wisconsin. Right behind it was Maryland. And then behind that was our case, North Carolina, the Rucho case. The problem was that Wisconsin was a Republican gerrymander. And if we had been able to line it up a little bit better, I think ideally we would have tried to get the Maryland case ripe for decision at the same time as the Wisconsin case, at a time that Anthony Kennedy was still on the court. Unfortunately, only the Wisconsin case kind of got up before the Supreme Court out on merits level. They didn't get to review the Maryland case yet. And at that very moment, Anthony Kennedy announced his retirement. And so what I'll say is that I think for a variety of reasons in 2018, the Supreme Court punted the decision in 2017 when Anthony Kennedy could have been ready to do it. And then by 2018, we were both too close to the redistricting cycle about to start. But also I think he didn't want to go out that way. And so we ended up with a decision from the Supreme Court saying that partisan gerrymanders are not within the realm of federal courts to decide, but, footnote, but, states can continue to come up with ways that, you know, might solve that problem. They go through a litany of things that the states could do, though they don't give an endorsement to any of them, but they say we should note that states have, through their initiative processes, changed by creating commissions, that there is state litigation, like what happened in Pennsylvania, to use the state constitution to protect against partisan gerrymanders, and maybe the House of Representatives will act and try to curtail it. What I will say is that there are just over 20 states that have a clause in their state constitution, like Pennsylvania. It's called the Free Elections Clause or Free and Fair Elections Clause. North Carolina was one of them. So after Rucho happened, we went back to state court, and because North Carolina has a free elections clause, we were able to invoke that, go through the state court process, and the state court found that there was in fact a violation of the state constitution and ordered that the gerrymander be redrawn. Because there are about 20 states that have that free and fair elections clause, we anticipate that in 2021 and 2022, if there are future gerrymanders that are drawn based on trying to give one party versus another an advantage, we will be using state constitutions as one route to challenge those partisan gerrymanders. Mm-hmm. We may also be going into those states to try to add free and fair elections clauses into their state constitutions, because those constitutions not only protect against partisan gerrymanders, they could be also used to fight against vote suppression. In North Carolina, that same clause has been used to review their voter ID rules and found in favor that, you know, if it goes too far and if it's intended to put a finger on the scale for one party versus another, or to disenfranchise traditionally disenfranchised communities, that the free and fair clause can also be used to protect against that.
Great, thank you for that. And we've got about 5 minutes left, and I want to ask you each one last question. But before that, there is a question here from Anne asking, I understand there are efforts to improve voter turnout, voter registration, voter engagement. And I'll use that as a chance just to advertise the next event in this series, which is specifically on that issue of voter engagement, voter registration, particularly focusing on the youth population of California, but also in other parts of the country. That's October 5th from 5:30 to 7 with a whole host of people on that, including Veronica Tariquez, who's a sociology professor here at UC Santa Cruz, and then a number of youth. We'll get some youth voices into the conversation of people who've been involved in the Central Valley and other places, actually getting more youth engagement. But the last set of questions for each of you is a chance to talk a little bit about, there's a whole host of questions here about, you know, what do we do if this particular election is contested on election night? And you know, in most cases, the question is if Trump doesn't accept the results, but, you know, let's just say if there's a contested election and it goes to states and counting elections and we're not sure what's going to happen, what should we be preparing for and thinking about doing in that eventuality? And I hate to sort of end on that note, but I hope you both can sort of think a little bit about, you know, as we come up to this election, there's some suggestions here about should we be prepared to go to other states where there's potential contestation to protect county clerks, or, you know, are there ways that we should be thinking about, you know, legally defending mail-in ballots or other things? But maybe I'll start. I don't know who wants to start. I want you both to answer that question of coming back to this election and the potential challenges to the integrity of this election. What can we be doing and should we be thinking about doing to prepare for that?
Well, if I could just one positive note, not that this is going to happen, but, you know, with Anne's question about efforts to improve voter turnout, you know, one idea is you take President's Day, that ridiculous holiday we have in February, whenever it is, and you turn that into National Election Day in November, right? So we have a National Election Day that is indeed a federal holiday. And I think Lincoln and Washington would both like that better than having them jointly honored some in February. So we can do things that aren't that hard to make voting easier and so forth. As far as, you know, the possible unrest and chaos after this election, I think of several of the questions, Chris Crone's questions, other people's questions, reflect that great deal of uncertainty. And I think every day we see that there is, you know, this greater potential, or the potential for unrest and civil unrest and violence is very real. So what we do as Californians, most of us being Californians, that's part of one of the questions is, you know, it's pretty clear that Biden will win in California. So should we be doing other things? Well, I think, you know, part of it is if you're concerned about that, you can obviously send money to whichever party you favor, because the legal eagles are certainly busy at work. After Bush versus Gore, after the 2000 election, and going into this election, you know, both parties are very prepared to fight these legal battles. And so I think, you know, whatever support they can get, and monetary and otherwise, whether you should travel to another state under the current conditions of our pandemic to help protect the vote, I maybe let you decide that on a personal level, but certainly rendering monetary support for the legal efforts could be vital.
I think we'll give you the last
really good point. So what I'd like to suggest is that we not wait until election day to get involved. One of the first things that you can do is in your own local jurisdiction, you can volunteer to be an election worker. It's much, much needed, or a poll monitor. Common Cause collaborates with a lot of organizations to put on something called election protection, and you can go to protectthevote.net to sign up. We also are engaged in sending out information that counters some of the disinformation that's out there, to make sure that if somebody is ready to vote, that they're fully ready and that they've sort of cleared all the hurdles, but also that they're not getting disinformation. So you know that there are some disinformation campaigns like, hey, Republicans vote on Tuesday, Democrats vote on Wednesday, right? And so the process that we use actually only requires that somebody have a cell phone, and you can be part of efforts to text true information to voters to make sure that they know how to vote. If they're going to vote, you know, by mail, that they've got a plan for doing that so that the ballot arrives on time and it's counted. And if they vote in a state that has some pretty severe requirements, like you have to have a witness, you know, sign, and you've got to sign correctly, and you've got to put your address in, that we're walking people through to make sure that as they're jumping through each one of those administrative hurdles, that's not the reason why their ballot doesn't get counted. That way, when the ballot arrives at the headquarters, instead of having the battle that we saw in Florida in 2000, where, you know, they're looking at each ballot and trying to decide whether, you have many, many more ballots that cleared all the hurdles and they're not subject to challenge. The more that we can kind of get out of the pile that is in debate right after Election Day, the better. And so I would say that, you know, even remotely from the comfort of your own living room using your own cell phone, you can be helping people in many, many different states if you sign up for those things. Common Cause is one of the organizations that does it. You can go through the internet and find your favorite nonprofit and find one of those kinds of election protection types of activities. Again, protectthevote.net is one way to do that. And I would just end on that. I think that participating in our elections in record numbers, whether that is in California or helping citizens around the country participate in elections, will be the biggest antidote to manipulation and tampering of our elections and rejection of the results. Because if you have something that is close to 100% voter turnout, it is much harder for anybody, any party, to try to disregard that result. And so I would say we have a way to do this, and that is to make sure that we're voting ourselves and we're helping other people who are we're registered and eligible to vote to also participate.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kathy, and thank you, Dan, for sharing with us your insights and work and research. And thank you to all of you who've joined us tonight. We obviously couldn't do this without you, and we really appreciate the opportunity to share this work with you. We've been putting resources in the chat function, which you can see there. And we hope to see most of you at our next session, October 5th, 5:30, when we'll be talking about voter engagement. And voter registration, and helping to do exactly what Kathy's talking about, of getting more people to participate in the political process in multiple ways. With that, we're done. Thank you and good night.